All right. Well, welcome everyone to today's live stream. Today we are covering chapter 3 of the compendium. This is the third and final chapter of the colonial era. So, the colonial era on our website consists of 3 chapters. Chapter 1, La Conquista from 1492 to 1603, from Christopher Columbus to the death of Queen Elizabeth I. Chapter 2, Nova Britannia from 1603, which is the start of the reign of James I, to 1675, which is the restoration of Charles II. And now, today, we get to discuss Chapter 3, the Intercolonial Wars from 1675 until 1763. Now, on our website, we have a chapter page for each of the 26 chapters, and it looks like this. Each chapter is divided into sections, and so this chapter is divided into 4 sections. Each one covers a different intercolonial war. There's a bunch of different names for these wars. They're called French and Indian Wars. Some of them have more specific names like King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and then the French and Indian War. And so we call them the Intercolonial Wars, which I got that name from what the French call this time period, the Intercolonial period, or Intercolonial War period. And so we're going to be discussing each of the 4 intercolonial wars themselves, and each war gets its own dedicated section, and each section has its own interactive timeline, like what you can see right here. And each of these events and documents on the timeline help give context to like what's going on during this time period, and each of these you can click on and go through like a slideshow, but it's also more interactive than a slideshow. And so let's go right into the first intercolonial war. And so we begin in 1675. This is still the reign of Charles II. He has 10 more years in his reign, and starting in 1675 and lasting for a couple of years, we have 2 conflicts that aren't really related, but they're happening at the same time. You have King Philip's War, which is more in the New England area, and then you have like New York, New England area, and then you have Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. So both of these things are happening at the same time. And the inciting incident for the King Philip's War is a body of a Native American who was Christianized, and his body is found in January of 1675. Because of this, 3 Wampanoag men are executed following a murder trial of that guy. So John Sassaman, he is murdered, his body is found, and then the colonists who were friends with John Samuelson, he's a Native American, decide to arrest 3 Wampanoag men and have them executed. And this will be the inciting incident for King Philip's War with the Wampanoag people. As you can see, violence quickly breaks out with the Swansea incident, and this is led by Medicom. That's King Philip. King Philip is his French name. Medicom is his Native American name, and he's a Wampanoag. See some more violence during King Philip's War that we have on the timeline. A bunch of these raids, and most Native American violence back and forth with the colonists are really small raids. They don't really have large pitched battles that will come later between European powers rather than Native Americans. So a lot of these are just ambushes, raids, skirmishes, and stuff like that. A few battles for King Philip's War. Charles II makes a proclamation enforcing the Navigation Act. If you remember, in the 1660s and going into the 1670s, Parliament passes a number of navigation acts, and these will become important literally 100 years later when the enforcement of these navigation acts will make the American colonists disgruntled and eventually lead to the American Revolution. So all these regulations are designed to support the English mercantilist system, which is very protectionist, maintaining full authority and regulation of the king, parliament, and the aristocrats who are also the shareholders of many of the companies in the colonies as well. Keep in mind, colonies are companies, and the companies have shareholders, and those shareholders, most of them, are members of parliament. Here's another massacre. This is one of the worst massacres during King Philip's War. Another raid. Providence, Rhode Island was burned. And it's during this time that Bacon, who this is a Nathaniel Bacon, he is a Virginian, and there is some Native American violence going on in Virginia. It's not related to King Philip's War, and Bacon will organize a bunch of former indentured servants in order to raise a militia to fight the Native Americans. And this angers the governor of Virginia, Berkeley, and who wanted to maintain a cautious native policy, probably because of the King Philip's War happening up north. He doesn't want violence to become as widespread as what's going on in New England and New York area. And so Berkeley wants to prevent the violence, but people on the frontier, colonists on the frontier, they're having to fight these minor skirmishes with the Native Americans, and they want better organization to fight the Native Americans, which the Virginia governor does not want to do. So there's some tension. There's economic tension, coastline and frontier, but also when it comes to greater geopolitical tension as well, where the royalist governor doesn't want to start a Native American war, a native war with a bunch of native tribes. He wants to maintain peace. There's another battle in Connecticut. Berkeley, this is Governor Berkeley of Virginia. He will renounce Nathaniel Bacon and try to arrest him for illegally raising forces. Bacon is arrested, but only briefly. Bacon then confronts Berkeley in a very famous event. I need to add a painting or an engraving of this event to the timeline. The House of Burgesses, which is the Virginia Colonial Assembly, will pass a number of reforms, reducing the governor-appointed power, expanding suffrage for homes for some settlers, and attempting to address corruption grievances. These laws reflected broader resentment against Virginia's political elite. So Bacon is being more popular, or is getting more popular by the people, and now in the House of Burgesses as well. And Bacon will make a declaration of the people, where it's like a manifesto accusing Berkeley of corruption, favoritism, failure to defend settlers, and improper relations with native peoples. So he's very much a populist, trying to get the people on his side versus the royal governor, Berkeley. And it's during this time that Metacom, that's King Philip, he dies, which effectively ends King Philip's War and ends native, at least Wampanoag, fighting in the war. There's still going to be some skirmishes here and there, but the organized native fighting is going to die down. And this right around this time in Virginia, you have Jamestown being burned by Bacon's forces. And so to prevent Berkeley from retaking it, they burned down the town. And shortly after, Nathaniel Bacon dies. So Bacon's rebellion is suppressed pretty quickly, and the great irony is, um, one day after Nathaniel Bacon dies, Charles II makes a proclamation for suppressing the rebellion in Virginia. So, news takes a lot of time to travel. Um, he didn't know that Bacon died, and so this was to arrest Bacon, but Bacon's dead. He died the day before. And by January of 1677, most of Bacon's rebellion is now fully suppressed by royal troops and Berkeley's forces. And so, simultaneously, King Philip's War and Bacon's rebellion happen and die out at pretty much the same time. And so, because of the fighting that Bacon and his men started, there is going to be a Treaty of Middle Plantation between Virginia and several native groups in order to restore um, um, some semblance of peace on the frontier in the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion. You have the Treaty of Casco, which is between the authorities of Maine and several Wabanaki groups after the fighting of the King Philip's War. So you have a number of treaties with Native Americans being formed in order to secure pre-violence peace before King Philip's War and then before Bacon's rebellion. So all these two things are happening simultaneously. And shortly after these early years, we have the start of the Popish plot in England. So Titus Oates, he is going to have these allegations that the Privy Council under Charles II is going to be influenced by Catholics, and the Catholics are going to try to assassinate King Charles II and place his brother James II to the throne, because James is very much in favor of Catholics. And so this begins what's known as the Exclusionary Parliament, and we have some more information about that on the timeline. Because of the fears of the Popish plot, England will pass the Test Act. This is the second Test Act, and the first one was passed during the earlier half of King Charles II's reign. And this required that all peers and members of the House of Commons should make a declaration against transubstantiation, invocation of saints, and the sacrificial nature of the Mass. The effect of this was to exclude Catholics from both houses, and in particular the 5 Popish lords from the House of Lords, a change motivated largely by the alleged Popish plot. And we have the first exclusionary or exclusion parliament, where anti-Catholic sentiments are very popular in Parliament, and they want to exclude, that's why it's called exclusion, James II from being heir to Charles II, since Charles II had no children. You have the second exclusion Parliament, which passed the Exclusion Bill, which is yet another attempt to exclude James II from being heir, and Charles II will veto both of these bills. And you have a third exclusion parliament shortly after. Then you have the creation of Pennsylvania, starting in 1681. Charles II gives a grant to Pennsylvania to William Penn, and this is to pay a debt owed to the Penn family for naval service during the English Civil War and then the interregnum as well. Here's some more documents for the foundation of Pennsylvania. There's the frame of government of Pennsylvania, an early constitution written by William Penn himself. New Jersey is being reorganized. At first, it was one colony, and it had two names. It was called Caesarea or something like that, named after Caesar, and also New Jersey, named after Jersey, England. And it it was one. It was multiple colonies combined into one, and then split into two, and then later it'll be combined again into one. It was organized and reorganized several times over. So this is the Constitution of East New Jersey. So around New York area. During this time, you have Gove's, I think that's how you say it, Gove's rebellion erupted in New Hampshire when Edward Gove and other colonists protested the imposition of royal authority over local governance. The uprising was quickly suppressed, and Gove was tried and sentenced to death, later commuted, highlighting tensions between colonists and the crown over self-rule. So a lot of people will argue, and even contemporary to the 1760s, so 100 years after this, that the colonies were ruled with salutary neglect. And this is true to a certain extent, but it's also true that the king and parliament will try to regulate the colonies at various times. During Charles I, there was a lot of regulation. Charles II, which is what we're looking at right now, there was also a lot of regulation, especially with the Navigation Acts, that angered the colonists as well. Here's another Pennsylvania frame of government, which is a reform, a revised constitution for Pennsylvania. Randolph, a royal customs official, Edward Randolph, submitted reports condemning the government of the Massachusetts Bay Company for violating the terms of its charter and resisting royal authority. So pretty early on, you see the colonists were not really willing to enforce the royal prerogative all that much. And so this will lead to even more regulation, more oversight by the king and parliament. In fact, the very next document is the Massachusetts Bay Colony being revoked. And that is to reestablish the colony under stricter, more royal authority under what would become known as the Dominion of New England, which combines Massachusetts and a few other New England colonies into one colony. And I think I have a map on here. It's coming up soon. And this is one of the last things that Charles II does before he dies, and James II, his brother, who is very much a Catholic sympathizer, because he's a Catholic himself, and he becomes king despite the exclusion parliaments that Charles II had to veto. And like I said about the dissolution of the Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter, Massachusetts and the broader New England, including New York and New Jersey, will be combined into one colony, and that colony is the Dominion of New England. And this does not last long, as the colonists themselves, at this point, even though it's only been 80 years since the founding of the first colony in 1606-07, and even though it's only been 80 years, there's a strong colonial identity in each of these colonies, and so especially in New England, and they especially don't like the Catholic authority of James II. So you have a religious aspect to it, you have the identity of the colonists themselves. They do not like lords, they don't really like the king either, especially a Catholic one. And I cannot stress this enough, how important the enclosure movement is. I talked about this yesterday on yesterday's live stream about Chapter 2, which included James I and Charles I's reigns. And the enclosure movement kicked a lot of people, mostly Puritans out of England, out of their homes, communal living, and these people were masterless. They didn't have a lord over them. They lived on common land, centered around the church. At first, it was Catholic churches under Henry VIII. They were dissolved, but now it's more Puritan, Anglican churches, and a lot of these people will be kicked out of England and sent to the New World under James I. There's a couple of laws that he passed kicking out vagabonds to the New World, and a lot of people who are impacted greatly by the enclosure movement, losing their homes, their livelihoods, their way of life, their communal living, are going to be forced economically to go to the New World to seek opportunities, not just of wealth, but to restore the communal lifestyle that they were used to before the enclosure movement took that away from them. And so a lot of the colonies are going to support communal living, a form of community-centric democracy, if you can call it that. A very, very simple version of democracy where the people have representatives in these small assemblies, and they're not going to be under a lord. So there's no aristocrats in the colonies. There's no lords. There's no monarchs in the colonies themselves. The closest thing to an aristocrat is a proprietor, like the Penn family or Lord Baltimore of Maryland. And this is going to lead to a number of problems later on. Well, for Maryland, the problem already happened in the last chapter during the interregnum of England, when there was no king. The mostly Protestant people living in Maryland will overthrow the Catholic authority of the proprietor of Baltimore in Maryland, but later that would be restored under Charles II during the Royal Restoration. And so the enclosure movement is very important in understanding the kinds of people who are living in the British North America. There are people who don't like aristocrats and lords, since it was and kings, because it was the king who sold the common land to the aristocrats, who then kicked these people out of the land that they, for generations, were living on and depended on for their livelihoods. Those communities were also church-centric, where a church would help organize the community, and because of the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, and then later persecution by James I, and then Charles I, and then Charles II, they will persecute a bunch of these smaller monasteries all over England. And so these church-centric communal peoples will, without masters, will leave England and then go to the New World, and those are the types of people who will settle the New World. So whenever the king and parliament tried to, parliament is mostly made of aristocrats, especially the House of Lords, but even the House of Commons are the wealthy merchant class, which in England are marrying into the lords and stuff like that. But Parliament is more on the side of the king. Not right now under James II. Parliament will overthrow James II. But when it comes to ruling the colonies, the king and Parliament will impose their authority more and more on the colonies at the disapproval and without the approbation of the colonists themselves. So this is a major example of the monarchy and Parliament trying to force the colonies to be something that the colonists don't want to be, and that is the single colony under the dominion of New England. James II will pass the Declaration of Indulgence, also known as the Declaration for Liberty of Conscience, suspending the enforcement of penal laws against Catholics and Protestant dissenters throughout the kingdom. The declaration asserted the king's authority to dispense with laws enacted by Parliament of England and granted greater religious freedom to groups excluded from the established church. So this is going to anger Parliament a lot. Some of these codes were passed under Charles II, forcing people to be Anglican, and James II, someone who isn't an Anglican, he's a Catholic, while also simultaneously being the church of the head of the Church of England, he is going to allow more religious tolerance for mostly Catholics, and this is going to anger the Puritan-minded Protestant dissenters of the Catholics, and so this will lead to what would become the Glorious Revolution. So England was actually fighting against religious liberty at this time, only because they hated Catholics. Here's the Declaration for Liberty of Conscience, and I actually have two of the same document, so I'll have to get rid of one of these. Let's see. During this time, Isaac Newton is doing his thing, creating calculus. So this is 1687. I like to add little things like this so that people know like what else is going on, and not just in political history, but also in scientific history. Like the last chapter, I included what Galileo was doing. In the first chapter, I should have included Copernicus. I forgot to add him to the timeline, so I'll have to add him for next year's live streams. And so I have Copernicus, Galileo, and now Isaac Newton, and a bunch of other people as well. Governor Andros, he is the governor of the Dominion of New England. He will raid a French trading post, and this is one of the inciting incidences for what would become the King William's War. It doesn't start right now, obviously, because William isn't king yet. Right now it's James II, but the Glorious Revolution will happen, replace James II with King William and his wife Mary. So it's William and Mary, co-monarchs. And so the setup for King William's War, which is pretty much a New England conflict between French colonists and English colonists, is beginning under James II. James II will reissue the Declaration for Liberty of Conscience, and leading to open resistance from the Anglicans, which again will lead to the Glorious Revolution. William, that is William of Orange, will invade England to take the throne, and he arrives with a Dutch army, which is not good, to challenge the rule of his father-in-law, James II. James II flees England in December of 1688, and at the start of 1689, William and Mary become co-monarchs, and they will have to deal with the aftermath or the conflict of a number of colonies revolting against the authority of the king and parliament, mostly over the Dominion of New England, and also fighting the French and their native allies at the same time. William and Mary will pass some reforms onto the colonies. This proclamation instructed officials in the American colonies to maintain their posts and continue governing under the authority of the new monarchs, William and Mary, thereby preserving administrative stability across the English Empire. In effect, the order sought to prevent disruption in colonial governance over the overthrow of James II. And so when Charles I was overthrown, there was, during the English Civil War, there was a lot of violence going on in the colonies. And so to prevent violence going on in the colonies, William and Mary tried to reassure the colonists. Of course, this does not really work out, as we have a Boston revolt against Governor Andros, who is the governor of the Dominion of New England. In May of 1689, William and Mary will declare war against France, and this is the start of the First Intercolonial War. That is a conflict between France and England in North America, and it pitted New England colonists and their Iroquois allies against New France and its native allies, marked by raids, massacres, and frontier devastation. And the conflict will end with the Treaty of Ryswick, restoring pre-war boundaries but leaving deep hostilities unresolved. So this is the first time that the French and the English the colonists for both France and England in North America will go have a full-out war. So this is the first intercolonial war. You have the Toleration Act, an act granted freedom of public worship to most Protestant dissenters, including Baptists, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians, provided they swore oaths of allegiance to the crown and accepted certain doctrinal requirements, while explicitly excluding Catholics, Unitarians, and non-Christians from its protectors. So the Pilgrims, a lot of them are, I think all of them are Unitarian, and then you have a bunch of Catholics and non-Christians from the protection. So it's somewhat religious toleration because you're tolerating more than just the Church of England, but at the same time, it's not really what we understand to be religious toleration. In New York, you have another colonial revolt called Leisler's Rebellion in New York, which was a merchant seized control of the colonial government in the wake of England's Glorious Revolution, claiming to act in the name of William and Mary. The rebellion exposed deep divisions between wealthy elites and aspiring merchants, ultimately ending with Leisler's arrest and execution in 1691. You have the Cohico Massacre. This is during King William's War. Again, most of the native violence are raids, massacres, and ambushes and skirmishes, not really pitched battles. So you have a bunch of these massacres going on at the same time. And the French and their native allies will massacre English colonists and their native allies, and vice versa. So that really defines the fighting style of the intercolonial wars, all the way up until really the last one, the French and Indian War, is really one of the only ones with actual pitched land battles, at least. And a lot of the battles are actually sea battles to capture ports and stuff like that. Part of the Glorious Revolution is the establishment of the English Bill of Rights. And this happened in December of 1689. It established constitutional limits on the powers of the monarchy, affirming parliamentary authority, free elections, and protections for individual liberties. It laid the foundation for modern democracy in England and influenced political thought in the American colonies, including ideas about rights and government accountability. So the English Bill of Rights will have an impact and influence on the Americas, especially for our founding fathers, and the establishment of our own Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. During this time, you have John Locke writing his second treatise of government, or two treatises of government. We only have the second one, which talks about this one right here, the latter, is an essay concerning the true original extent and end of civil government. So there's two essays. We only have the second one, because the second one is really the only one that deals with governance, at least in like civic statecraft and civic theory, and so that's what we're interested in teaching. And so we have this one right here, and you can read all the primary source documents that we have on the timeline. We have a read document button at the end of the description. You click on that, and it will take you to the full text of the document. Right now, this is just linking to the Project Gutenberg ebooks. Eventually, we will be republishing all these primary sources onto our own website, onto this website that you see here. Here's yet another massacre in King Philip's War, this time in New York. You have the Simon Falls Raid. Again, at this time, most of the violence are massacres, raids, and stuff like that. The English will capture Port Royal. And so this is in Acadia, which is modern-day Nova Scotia. Acadia will be the main region of violence in the Intercolonial Wars, all the way up to the French and Indian War. For that war, most of the violence will be in the interior. Then we have William and Mary proclamation for apprehending William Penn. Let me actually refresh this real quick, because I'm pretty sure I added a description. Yeah, there we go. And so William Penn is under the suspicion that he tried to support James II and the Jacobite supporters following the Glorious Revolution. And so Penn will be apprehended, arrested, and his charter will be revoked, or at least his proprietary ownership of Pennsylvania will be revoked, but he will be restored soon after. There's yet another attack. So following the revolt in Boston against Governor Andros over the issue of the Dominion of New England, they decided to reestablish the colonies. And so they remade the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1691 with this charter. And for this one, they combined the original Plymouth colony, with the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Maine Colony. So at first, those three were separate colonies, and then they, along with others, were combined into the Dominion of New England. And now the Dominion of England is being reorganized into the smaller colonies again, but some of the original smaller city-level colonies are now being merged into medium-sized colonies. So all this reorganization happening, these mergers and separations and all these things, it's kind of hard to keep track of, but I think we're trying to do a decent job keeping track of that. And for this charter, they separate the Dominion of New England, but they also merge some of the smaller colonies together. So this is Massachusetts as the colonies knew it for, in time of our revolution. French will make some progress in Maine, which is just south of Acadia. And during this time, during King William's War, you have the Salem witch trials, which to me are overrated. Given everything else that's going on in the colonies, King William's War, colonial revolts against the authority of Parliament and the King over the Dominion of New England, and the establishment of the English Bill of Rights, and all these infinitely more important things. I think when people talk about the Salem witch trials without talking about the broader political environment, I think they're giving the Salem witch trials too much attention. The Salem witch trials is not the most important thing happening at this time. Here's a French naval victory, a rare French naval victory against the English in the Atlantic. William Penn is restored as proprietor of Pennsylvania in August of 1694. And soon after, Mary II, the wife of King William, will die. Pennsylvania we'll have a new frame of government. Again, there's all these rechartering and reconstituting, and we're trying to keep track of all of it on this timeline. And then what's interesting is William Penn of Pennsylvania will propose what he called the Penn's Plan for a Colonial Union. And this proposed a coordinated assembly of the English colonies in North America to improve common defense. Excuse me. To improve common defense, resolve intercolonial disputes, and strengthen cooperation during the ongoing pressures of King William's War. So you have the colonists. They're complaining about Parliament and the King forcing the colonies to be together, like with the Dominion of New England. But at the same time, the colonists themselves are working more closely together. And so it's like, yeah, the colonists want to work together. They want to cooperate. They want to establish this joint assembly all the way back in 1690s. As long as it's not the British, the king and parliament forcing us to do it. Like, we want to do it on our own terms. And so, it's just interesting to see the dynamics. Like, the policy itself of having the colonies together is a good policy. And the colonists will recognize that, especially leading into the American Revolution, where they understood that working together is better than working separately and individually. But they don't want the king or parliament to tell them to work together. They want to work together on them by their own terms. And so that's just an interesting aspect of the relationship between the colonists and Parliament, but also the colonists between other colonists. And you have the Peace of Ryswick, which will end the King William's War. It's also called the 9 Years' War between France and the Grand Alliance of the Dutch and England, restoring most of the territorial holdings to their pre-war owners. And it will not lead to lasting peace. Peace only lasts a few years. And now we have the rest of William, his reign. He is alone. He does not have any heir. And Charles II will die. He had no heir as well. And Philip of Anjou will become King of Spain. Charles II was the last Habsburg king of Spain, and now you have more of the French Bourbon dynasty taking over the Spanish throne. And so Philip of Anjou will become Philip V of Spain. And this succession will lead to the War of the Spanish Succession during Queen Anne's War, which will begin in a couple years. And so it's all these wars are like related or have a great impact or impacted by the, like, who's married to who and who has heirs and stuff like that. It's kind of ridiculous. Or it's very ridiculous that wars are fought over who marries who. And so during this time, you have an issue with piracy. William will make a proclamation for apprehending pirates. You have the Act of Settlement. Parliament determines that the line of succession must be Protestant. It declared that after the deaths of Queen Anne and her heirs, none of whom survived, the crown would pass to the nearest Protestant heir, Sophia of Hanover, and her descendants. Because Sophia died shortly before Queen Anne, the throne instead passed in 1714 to her son, who became George I of Great Britain. And so, in effect, this act passed under William ensured a Protestant succession, excluding Catholic claimants, especially the Stuart line, and permanently shifted the British monarchy into the Hanoverian dynasty after 1714, following the reign of Queen Anne. You have the Pennsylvania Charter of Privileges, yet another colonial document on liberties of the colonists. Uh, Delaware is being created. It's actually created by William Penn, granted a separate charter of government to the lower counties on the Delaware, and it became its own colony, Delaware. And then King William dies on March 8th, 1702. He doesn't have any heirs, and so the person who follows him is Queen Anne. This is Queen Anne, and she won't have any heirs too. And at the very beginning of Queen Anne's reign, she will declare war on France and Spain. And so this is Queen Anne's War, the Second Intercolonial War, and the English colonists clash with French and Spanish forces and their native allies across New England, South, and Canada. So pretty much all of the British North American colonies. Here's the Siege of Augustine, where English forces from Carolina, at this time Carolina is one colony, it's not yet North and South Carolina, and invaded Spanish Florida with the aim of capturing St. Augustine. The Spanish garrison repelled the English. The Battle of Vigo Bay, English and Dutch fleet destroy Spanish treasure fleet, a major financial blow to Spain. Raid on Deerfield, Massachusetts. French and Wabanaki forces under Jean-Baptiste Hurtel de Rouville raid Deerfield, killed 56 and captured over 100. And then this is the second act of Union, establishing Great Britain, united the kingdoms of England and Scotland into the new kingdom of Great Britain. The Union established a single parliament at Westminster while preserving Scotland's separate legal system, church, mostly Presbyterian, and educational institutions. The creation of Great Britain marked a major constitutional transformation in the British Isles and laid the political foundation for the expansion of the British Empire during the 18th century. So the consolidation and really the creation of Britain as a nation will allow for better parliamentary control, military power, because they're combining English and Scottish forces when it comes to fighting their enemies. And what you see during this time is the creation of these countries. Like with Spain, at the start of the compendium, we begin in 1492. Spain is not yet Spain. Spain is Castile and Aragon and a few other smaller city-states. It will develop into Spain with the union of Castile and Aragon, establishing Spain. You have this going on, the establishment of Great Britain, which combines Scotland and England. You also have something very similar going on in France. So this period is not only the creation of the colonies and the development of the colonies, it's also the creation of these countries, because they weren't countries. Certainly not like this, not this kind of constitutional structure, until the colonial era. So, all this is happening at the same time. It's not like these countries were established and then the colonies were formed. No, these countries were formed while the colonies were being established, which means that some of the English colonies are older than the country of Great Britain. In fact, most of the colonies are older than the country of Great Britain, except for maybe like Georgia, which will be founded a couple decades after this. You have the Siege of Port Royal. British forces under Francis Nicholson sieged and captured Port Royal in Acadia. French Governor Daniel d'Aguer de Supercase, I know I butchered that, surrendered. So the British retake Port Royal. So they took it during King William's War, but part of the Treaty of Ryswick is to restore the French territory and gave back Port Royal to the French, and now the English just took it again. Battle of Bloody Creek, Wabanaki Confederacy ambushed a British force of 70 regulars and killing them. So again, most of the violence are sieges, ambushes, skirmishes, and raids, as opposed to full-on European-style pitched battles. Here's the Walker expedition, failed British invasion of Canada. Here's the Treaty of Utrecht between England and France. There was multiple treaties of Utrecht, and this established peace, ending the Second Intercolonial War, which is Queen Anne's War. And then here's the Treaty of Utrecht between England and Spain. So they negotiated their treaties separate. And then the next year, Queen Anne dies, and George I becomes King of England. In 1715, you have a Jacobite uprising. Jacobite is in reference to Jacobus or James. And so these are the people who support the descendants of James II, who was deposed during the Glorious Revolution less than 20 years before this. Louis XIV, the Sun King, dies, and Louis XV becomes King of France. Battle of Sheriffmuir, I think I'm saying that right, in England. Scottish Jacobites clash with government forces. The battle is inconclusive, but it halts the Jacobite advance south. So the Jacobites, they're starting out in Scotland, and they're making their way down south. Jacobites capture Newcastle. Then you have the Battle of Preston. Government forces under Charles Wills defeat the Jacobites, and hundreds are captured. And during this time, while Britain is preoccupied with a Jacobite uprising and following the end of Queen Anne's War, many sailors who fought in Queen Anne's War, fought against the Spanish and the English, will turn to piracy in order to make a living. And so Blackbeard, his name is Benjamin Hornigold, he and other people like Blackbeard will become pirates. Benjamin Hornigold, Blackbeard, and a few others that we have. Samuel Black Sam Bellamy is another one. He dies in 1717. George I will make a proclamation for suppressing the pirates. So this is the golden age of piracy, by the way, which only lasts like less than a decade, following the end of Queen Anne's War until the death of the last of the famous notorious pirates. You have the siege of Charlestown by Blackbeard himself. Governor Rogers is sent to deal with the pirates. Blackbeard is killed in 1718. So, like, Blackbeard, he begins in 1716, and he dies in 1718. That's only 2 years. And then you have the execution of Stede Bonnet, yet another pirate. You have the execution of Calico Jack Rackham, yet another pirate who's associated with the famous female pirates Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Both of them will be executed in April of 1721. And Black Bart Roberts, the last of the infamous pirates, will raid some ships off of the coast of Africa, and then eventually, or soon after, in February of 1722, he dies, and he is the last of the infamous pirates of the golden age of piracy that we have on the timeline. And of course, right after he dies, we have the start of the First Acadian War. And so this is fought mostly between the English colonists in New England and the former, or I guess current, French native allies. So it's not the French directly, but it's their French, it's the French native allies that are fighting the English New Englanders. And so there's a number of different names for this war. I think the most common one is the Wabanaki War. Um, we decide to name it the First Acadian War since it's the first major conflict in Acadia between New Englanders and the native Acadians, who are French allies, without involving the French. And so there'll be a second Acadian War that we have on the timeline as well. Philip V abdicates, and Louis I becomes King of Spain. Remember, Philip V was Philip of Anjou, a French guy, so he is abdicating for his son, Louis, to become king of Spain. However, Louis dies very shortly after this of smallpox, and Philip V, the guy who just abdicated, his father, will become king again, of Spain again. So, that happens. And then you have the explanatory charter of Massachusetts Bay. George I issued the explanatory charter of Massachusetts Bay, clarifying ambiguities in the colony's 1691 charter and settling disputes over the qualifications and powers of colonial officials. So again, you have the king and parliament getting involved in colonial affairs. So I want to challenge the concept of salutary neglect, which is a concept that's a term used in Parliament during the lead up to the American Revolution. I'm not really convinced that salutary neglect was an actual policy or an actual thing that happened, because the British, they're fighting pirates, they're issuing and then reissuing these charters, they're reorganizing the colonies, they're impacting the trade with the Navigation Acts. You have all these regulations going on by the king and parliament on the colonies. So I am much more skeptical of the idea of salutary neglect than most people are. I know it's a real concept, it's a contemporary concept, but when you look at all the evidence of all the different things that the king and parliament were doing to the colonies, I don't really think it's a true phenomenon, historical phenomenon. So that's up for debate. You have the Treaty of Boston, which ends the First Acadian War, which, if I, let's see, yeah, there's again, this war has a bunch of other names: the Wabanaki War, Dummer's War, Dummer's War, or Father Raleigh's War. We just call it the First Acadian War. And then the Spanish Siege of Gibraltar begins. This is the start of the Second Anglo-Spanish War, which begins, and it ends pretty quickly, at the end of King George I's reign. He actually dies a few months later in June of 1727, and that goes into the next section, which begins with the ascension of George II as king. And so the Siege of Gibraltar ends pretty quickly, and just a couple years later, you have the Treaty of Seville, which ends the Second Anglo-Spanish War. It restores peace and commerce, and it is this treaty, along with a few other treaties, that will secure Spanish neutrality in the next couple intercolonial wars. So the Spanish, although they're allied with the French, are not going to join the French in fighting the English during, especially the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, which we have as the Fourth Intercolonial War. But that's going to be the next section. You have the Treaty of Vienna. This treaty established a defensive pact in which Britain and Austria guaranteed each other against aggression and helped secure international acceptance of the Pragmatic Sanction for Maria Theresa's succession to the Austrian throne. So Spain and France are friends, and now England, the Dutch, and the Austrians are friends, opposed to like the Prussians and Russians and a few other nations. So trying to keep track of all these treaties because they're always changing is kind of difficult. But again, I think we're doing at least a half decent job keeping track of the treaties and who's aligned to who and how that will impact the wars to come. You have Jenkins' ear incident. A lot of people say that this is the start of Jenkins' ear or war for Jenkins' ear. It's not. The war won't begin for another couple years, so it's not really the war for Jenkins' ear. It's just one of many incidences between the Spanish and the British, who are trying to establish peaceful and economic relations, end up fighting each other. The war for Jenkins' ear will begin 8 years after this event. So it's not really a war for Jenkins' ear. It's a war for a completely different issue that we're about to talk about. And then we have the establishment of Georgia, my home state of Georgia. The Charter of Georgia in 1732. It's named after King George. I'm not sure if it's the first or the second. Maybe George II is naming it after his father, or maybe he's naming it after himself. This charter created a corporate body of trustees and granted them authority to establish and administer the colony on behalf of the crown. Now, the colony itself was established, the authority to establish a colony is obviously the king, but the guy who established the colony is a British general named Oglethorpe. And he is a very interesting guy. He is very much a humanitarian. He makes Georgia a refuge for criminals and petty thieves and vagabonds, and also outlaws slavery. He also outlaws accepting non-white people into the colony. That law will be made in 1735. It's not part of the original charter, but it also bans slavery as well. So slavery is not allowed in Georgia, of all places, at the start of the colony's history. That will be revoked. That policy will be revoked by the king and forced slavery into Georgia on behalf of and lobbied by the slave masters of South Carolina, who wanted to expand their operation into Georgia. So, a little complicated. Excuse me. At the same time, you have the passage of the Molasses Act, which is yet another regulation, which is a tariff on molasses, sugar, and rum imported into North America from other colonies, like in the Caribbean. And so, again, the idea of salutary neglect. This is yet another example, another proof against the idea that Parliament was not intervening in colonial affairs before the 1760s. They absolutely were. So, although I understand the sentiment of salutary neglect, I don't fully agree with the implications of absolutely no Parliament authority and control and regulation of the colonies. Here's yet another treaty, the Pacte des Familles. This is securing the alliance between France and Spain, since both are now ruled by members of the Bourbon family. I spelled Bourbon wrong. Uh-oh, I want to have to change that. That's how you know this is not AI generated, because of all the spelling mistakes. That's just me. And so the Philip V, who is Philip of Anjou, he's a French guy. The Anjou family is a branch of the Bourbon family, not the Bourbon family. And then the King of France is obviously a Bourbon, Louis the 15th. Then an interesting event in Pennsylvania happens called the Walking Treaty and the Walk. And so I'm actually impressed that we still have this document from 1737. And so this Walking Treaty in Pennsylvania is a treaty with Native Americans, where specifically the Delaware natives, Lenape, where they will grant the Pennsylvanians a deed to a land that can be covered by a individual person walking for a certain distance. I think it's like a day or something like that, a day and a half. And the treaty itself transferred vast tracts of Lenape land to in eastern Pennsylvania to the proprietors of the Penn family, setting the legal framework that will later be exploited during the walk carried out later this year. So I don't know why the Lenape agreed to this treaty, but in a couple months in September, this is the actual map. It's kind of hard to see of the walk itself, and the Pennsylvanians, what they did is they prepared the path ahead of time. So they cleared it out. They made it as straight as possible, so it's easier to, walk the distance and be able to make that distance in that time frame. And so the Pennsylvanians, they hire fast runners in the colony. They say the walk, but it was actually running. And yeah, it was kind of a cheap thing for the Pennsylvanians to do, but at the same time, it's kind of a ridiculous treaty for the Lenape to agree to in the first place. Um, I don't know. These people, they have free will, they have sovereignty, they can agree to these treaties as much as they want. Will they be tricked? Will they complain about it? Yeah, but they're gonna give land to the Pennsylvanians anyway. So I don't know. It's like stupid stuff like these ridiculous treaties on both sides. The Native Americans for agreeing to the treaties, or maybe not even fully understanding the treaties, and also the colonists for making a bunch of these treaties and then breaking the spirit of the treaty, tricking the natives, or just outright not agreeing to the treaty and just taking more land. So it's like, what's the point of all these treaties? It's like a facade of peace, of peaceful negotiations, instead of fighting each other for every square inch of land. They have all these ridiculous treaties. I don't understand it. It's, I don't know, human nature, I guess. Speaking of human nature, that's funny. We have a treatise of human nature written by David Hume. David Hume, maybe I subconsciously thought of human nature in that last bit, from after reading David Hume's A Treatise on Human Nature. And this argues that all human knowledge and belief arise from sensory experience rather than reason alone. And I actually love Hume and his philosophy. Not 100% Humean guy, if that's even a term, but I am very interested in this kind of philosophy of empiricism and having an experimental attachment or method attached to reasoning. So a lot of philosophy before this point is just reasoning. Maybe not a lot, but there are philosophers before this point who argue that you can understand everything just by reasoning everything out with logic. And I don't believe that at all. I think that there's a lot of things about nature that we have to experience, that we have to learn through experimentation. And so this is the experimental method, which will have a great influence on the invention of science as being, the experiment part of the scientific method. And so David Hume will play a part in popularizing empiricism and experimentation. You have the Treaty of Pardo. This treaty proposed a proposed agreement between Great Britain and Spain intended to settle ongoing commercial and territorial disputes, but it was never fully ratified, and its failure directly helped trigger the war for the Asiento. So, what people call um, what people call the um, uh, War for Jenkins' Ear. I had to think of the name. We don't call it that on this timeline or in this compendium or in our curriculum. We call it the War for the Asiento because that's what the war was actually about. It wasn't about some British guy getting his ear chopped off 8 years prior. It was fought over the Asiento de Negros, which is a monopoly that Spain would issue out to a single country, usually the Dutch, and that monopoly will allow that country, that foreign country, to sell to Spain slaves from Africa. And so Spain was trying to, at this time, Spain does not have colonies in Africa because of the Treaty of Tordesillas that made it so that Africa is Portuguese territory, not Spanish territory. During the Iberian Union, where Spain and Portugal were united, they didn't need to have this Asiento. But now that Portugal and Spain are no longer united, and I have to add that to the timeline actually to have better context, but now that Portugal and Spain are not united as the Iberian Union, Spain has to issue out this Asiento, this monopoly, to another country, that has colonies in Africa in order to get slaves from Africa. And so the Asiento is usually issued to the Dutch. Spain has a long history with the Dutch, with Netherlands and Belgium, especially Belgium, because Belgium used to have been a territory of the Spanish. When the Holy Roman Emperor Charles I of Spain, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, he controlled not just Spain, but the Holy Roman Empire. He was also Habsburg, and he controlled Belgium as well. And so the Dutch were a clear choice for the Spanish to choose. They have a long history with each other, and the Dutch are now setting up colonies in Africa, getting slaves from the markets, and then selling those slaves to the Spanish in North America or in Central and South America, and the Caribbean. And so this monopoly, the English wanted the monopoly, and the Spanish were like reluctant to give it to them. And so the British go to war with Spain over Spain not granting Great Britain the Asiento, or at least not agreeing to the price that the South Sea Company wanted to have the Spanish pay. It's even more ridiculous than anything else on this timeline. This conflict between Spain and Britain over the Asiento is just a ridiculous development. And this is the War for the Asiento, which people call the War for Jenkins' Ear. We also call it the first of King George's Wars. So during this time, which most people call King George's War, singular, most people who talk about King George's War is only talking about the war between England and France that begins in 1744, but this conflict between between England and Spain begins all the way back 5 years back in 1739. And so we call it King George's Wars, plural, because there's two wars: a war against the Spanish at first, and then later the French will join on behalf of Spain, and that will become a much wider conflict, which most people just call that King George's War. That's the second King George's War for us on this timeline. So we do change the paradigm, the story that history is of like how history is presented. We do change some of the names, some of the time periods are a little bit off from what most people teach, and it's really for us. We're changing it because we're teaching history as a continuum. We're covering every single year of history from 1492 till today. And so we're not jumping around to different time periods. Unlike most historians and most educators, you know, we have to combine these years in between wars into periods with other wars or with the war itself. And so, how we divide that up, do we have the lead up to a war as being part of the war, or do we have it as the aftermath of the previous war, or do we keep that interregnum period a separate time period? So I mean, this is just how we decided to divide this history up. But because it's a continuum, we're covering every single year, we have to combine these periods of history that most people don't usually combine. And so we are combining the war between England and Spain. Again, most people call it the War for Jenkins' Ear. We call it the War for the Asiento because that's really what it's about. And that is part of the wider King George's Wars that the French will join later on. So, going back to the timeline, we have the Stono Slave Revolt. This is the first major revolt of slaves, slave revolt in English North America, and this is in South Carolina, Stono River, South Carolina. A group of enslaved Africans led by Jemmy, also called Cato, rose up in an attempt to escape to Spanish Florida, where they were promised freedom. Motivated by brutal conditions, harsh labor, and the desire for freedom, the revolt involved around 20 to 25 enslaved people initially, growing to about 60 rebels, and resulted in the deaths of roughly 25 white colonists and 35 to 50 enslaved rebels before it was violently suppressed. Its aftermath included the enactment of the Negro Act of 1740, which restricted enslaved people's movement, education, and assembly, and heightened fears of slave uprisings throughout the southern colonies, shaping stricter slave codes for decades. So, yeah, it's not a good thing. Slave revolt, which led to even stricter policies and growing fears, which will lead to the continuance of slavery for over 100 years. You have to keep in mind one of the arguments by Southerners for preserving the institution of slavery, and I'm going to cover this later in next couple of chapters, is the fear that once you free the slaves, because of all the horrific things that the slave masters did, the former slaves will seek vengeance against their masters and anyone who looked like their masters, white people. And so the fear of slave revolts and punitive measures by former slaves will convince slave masters and Southerners to not abolish slavery. So that kind of sucks. And it's during this time where we have King George II declaring war on Spain. Again, this is the official start of the War for the Asiento. This is the first of King George's wars, and most people call this specific conflict between England and Spain the War for Jenkins' Ear. We don't call it that, but just so you know what it is. And one of the first battles is the attack on La Guerra. And the governor of the province of Venezuela, Brigadier Don Gabriel de Zulaga, had prepared the fort defenses, and Spanish troops were well commanded by Captain Don Francisco Saucedo. On October 22nd, British Captain Waterhouse entered the port of La Guardia, flying the Spanish flag, expecting attack. The port gunners were not deceived by this ruse. They waited until the British squadron was within range, and then simultaneously opened fire. After 3 hours of heavy shelling, Waterhouse ordered a withdrawal. The battered British squadron sailed to Jamaica to undertake emergency repairs. So the first battle of the War for the Asiento is a British defeat. The next battle is a British victory, British capture of Portobello in Panama. And I just love this painting. This is such a nice painting. I love this time period of paintings. The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry by Gilbert Tennant. Oh yeah, it's the 1740s. This is the First Great Awakening. Now, again, we have a tradition at Amending America to revise a lot of the nomenclature of time periods and also of different wars, like not calling it the War for Jenkins' Ear, but instead calling it the War for the Asiento. We also don't like the name First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. For starters, it makes it sound like both of these events are connected, but they're really not. They're actually complete opposites when it comes to theology. The First Great Awakening is very much a Calvinist revival, and with this kind of Calvinism, it's about fire and brimstone. Mass is supposed to be very mature, very solemn. You're supposed to fear God, and you're a sinner in the hands of an angry God, and you have to pray for mercy and forgiveness and salvation, as opposed to the Second Great Awakening, which is a Methodist revival. And Methodism is very much against fire and brimstone. They are in favor of the idea that Christian faith and salvation is an individual journey. And so it's much more joyful. It's about individualism. It's about, having this journey with Christ throughout your life. And so you don't have to fear God, punishing you. You don't have to fear that God isn't going to elect you as someone who will receive salvation and make it to heaven. So Calvinism, very fire and brimstone, the First Great Awakening, and then the Methodist Second Great Awakening is very much an individualistic, centered type of Christianity. And so we don't call it those. We call the first one the Calvinist revival, or something like that, and then something Calvinist, and then the Second Great Awakening we call it the Methodist revival. So this is the Calvinist revival. You're going to have a bunch of these sermons, these very famous sermons during this time period, where it's like very much fire and brimstone. It's like, you better pray for forgiveness, pray that you're going to make it to heaven because you don't know, or else you're going to be burned by God. And this is happening while the War for the Asiento is happening as well. So again, these things, history, it's not so clear-cut as most historians like to present it as. There's so many things happening, all these different themes of history are actually happening at the same time. King George's Wars are happening at the same time as the Great Awakening, which, we call it the Calvinist revival. And the same thing is we're gonna show you in later chapters where different themes of history are happening at the same time, and you're gonna see this especially during the Progressive era or the Cold War era, where you have like the Cold War, and then you have the civil rights, and then you have other issues like the space race or the nuclear arms race, or economic development or stuff like that. All these different themes of history are happening at the same time. That's not how most educators teach history. They like to divide up history by themes. And so you don't see how one theme is happening at the same time as another theme and how that influences each other. And so these themes very much have an impact on each other. You have the destruction of Fort San Lorenzo, El Rey Chargres. Again, I'm butchering these Spanish and French names. There's another typo. It's supposed to be capital B. Where the English began to bombard the Spanish forces. Given the overwhelming superiority of the British forces, Captain Savoya surrendered the fort on the 24th of March after resisting for 2 days. Just like Portobello, the British destroyed the fort and seized the guns along with 2 Spanish patrol boats. George II proclamation for encouraging trade with America. Again, here's yet another document that disproves the salutary neglect theory, the idea that the king and parliament were not really regulating the colonies or not involved in colonial affairs. Looking at all this evidence, and I'm sure there's much more evidence. To me, it looks like there actually wasn't neglect by the king and parliament. There very much was a lot of these regulations and enforcement. Now, there was much more enforcement that will start up in the next chapter, leading up to the American Revolution. But for the idea that the king and parliament were not regulating the colonies or not getting involved in colonial affairs, that's just simply not true. So, the evidence can speak for itself. Here's the second attack on Cartagena de Indias. Admiral Vernon. That is the Admiral Vernon. It should sound familiar for anyone who knows about George Washington, because Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, is named after Admiral Vernon, this guy. And so Admiral Vernon, he attempted to bombard the fort, but is repelled by 6 Spanish ships of the line. Frederick II, he's my favorite monarch, which is saying a lot because I do not like monarchs at all. He is one of the very few monarchs that I do like. He's a Prussian guy, and he will start a lot of shenanigans in Central Europe, which will lead to the French and Indian War. Then you have, or I should say, the 7 Years' War in England, which is a separate conflict, but also somewhat connected to the French and Indian War, which is the 4th Intercolonial War in the American colonies. Here's yet another sermon during the Calvinist revival, the First Great Awakening, A Divine and Supernatural Light by Jonathan Edwards. He is a very important guy. Another thing about like the themes of history and how they overlap, during this period, during the Great Awakening, you have the births of most of our founding fathers. So the 1720s, 1730s, 1740s, this time period, during these wars and during this Calvinist revival, is when most of our founding fathers are born and are being raised as kids. So this is when they're born and what they're seeing, what they're going through, and what they're being educated. And they're being educated mostly by these sermons given by these Calvinist priests. Not really priests, pastors. Priests are more of a Catholic thing. And Anglican, I guess. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, he dies. And he's also the Austrian guy. And he issues the Austrian Empire, Austria, will go to Maria Theresa. She will become the Archduchess of Austria. And this is going to cause a secession crisis, the Austrian secession crisis, and which will lead to King George's war with the French. Remember, the British are aligned with the Austrians at this time. The Austrians, now under Maria Theresa, are going to fight the Prussians, and that's going to happen. That's the next event on the timeline. Frederick II will invade Silesia, which is with the Austrians. This begins the First Silesian War, but also the War for the Austrian Succession. Other kingdoms would attack Maria Theresa's Austria, such as Charles Albert of Bavaria. He will become the future Emperor Charles VII of the Holy Roman Empire, and also Louis XV of France, Philip V of Spain, Augustus III of Saxony and Poland, and Charles Emmanuel III of Sardinia. So Louis XV is going to attack Austria for the succession because they don't like Maria Theresa. Then, at the time, Austrians are allied with the British, and so the British are going to then attack the French. All these treaties and keeping track of the treaties alone is a hefty ordeal because they're going to be changing sides all the time. But then also keeping track of who's monarch and who's married to who and who's related to who, and that is also pretty difficult to do, or trying to do it. This is our attempt at doing it. While the war for the Austrian succession is going on, we have the continuance of the war for the Asiento, which, again, most historians call it the war for Jenkins' ear. We don't call it that because it's not about Jenkins' ear, which happened 8 years before the war began. We call it the war for the Asiento because that's the main issue that the English are fighting the Spanish over. Here's yet another sermon during the Great Calvinist Revival, or the Great Awakening. This time it is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards. This is a very famous sermon during this the Great Awakening. And it's a very interesting read. I encourage you guys to read it. And again, for all these primary source documents, we have a read document button. When you click on this, it will take you to the full text of these primary sources, if we have the primary source on the timeline. You have the Treaty of Breslau, which is the treaty that concludes the war between Austria and Prussia, between Maria Theresa and Frederick II, who would become known as Frederick the Great. Austria will cede most of Silesia to Prussia. This also ends the First Silesian War. Here's yet another battle, or I guess a raid, between the Spanish and the English. Again, part of the war for the Austrian succession, the French have attacked the Austrians, the English are allied with the Austrians, and so now the French and English are going to fight each other. The English are also allied with the Spanish, and so the English, or the French are allied with the Spanish, and so they're going to join the war that the Spanish and the English are. So it's like all these wars and all these treaties are happening at the same time. They're impacting each other, and all these treaties and alliances are always shifting. It's really annoying, and having to put together and try to keep track of. King George II, will, in return, declare war on the French. You have a raid of Canso, which is now the French forces, launching a raid on the British forces. This is in present-day Nova Scotia. Back then, it was called Acadia, when it was occupied by the French. Frederick II will pretty much join back into the conflict. He made peace with Austria for the First Silesian War, and now he's entering back into the conflict by invading Frederick II, or by invading Bohemia, and this begins the Second Silesian War. Again, keeping track of all these treaties and wars and who's fighting who and why is it's a pretty hefty ordeal. Here's the siege of Louisburg. The English will siege this very important port city, and they'll be sieging this for decades to come. Not in this single conflict, but they will constantly go and be sieging this port as well. Charles Edward Stuart lands in Scotland. This is the descendant of the original Jacobite rebellion, which happened 30 years prior in 1715. It's now 1745, and so this is Charles Edward Stuart. Bonnie Prince Charles lands in Scotland, beginning the Jacobite rebellion, also known as the 45, because it's 1745. And so, while all these wars are going on, an uprising in England happens with the Jacobites. And so a couple battles happen. And then you have the Treaty of Dresden, which ends the Second Silesian War, concluding the treaty, which concludes with the Treaty of Dresden, in which Austria again recognized Prussia's possession of Silesia, while Frederick the Great acknowledged Francis I as Holy Roman Emperor, cementing Prussia's gains and ending major fighting between the two powers. The Prussians. Here's the Battle of Culloden, which again is part of the Jacobite uprising, and it's a famous battle between the English and Scottish, where the Scots are now wearing these kilts, which is not an ancient tradition of the Scottish. The kilt wearing tradition is much later, is a much later development than what most people think. So the Scots were not wearing kilts during, William Wallace all the way back in, I don't know, the 1300s or whenever that happened. But they were wearing kilts during this time period. Philip V of Spain, he dies, and Ferdinand VI will become king. And Ferdinand VI, he is much more of a pacifist, and he will pursue peace negotiations, which will lead to the end of King George's War, King George's Wars, plural, because the Spanish are fighting the English in the War for the Asiento. So that will end with the same treaty that ends the war between England and France, which most people call King George's War. Peace negotiations begin in Lisbon. And again, this is why knowing who is monarch is so important, because who is monarch will have a major impact on which country sides with which country will fight which country will go to peace, sue for peace with which country. And so keeping track of who's monarch of all these countries is also very important to do. Not just the treaties and the wars and the battles and the laws and all these other things, but also who is monarch. And then in 1748, you have the publication of the Spirit of Laws. Excuse me. The Spirit of Laws by Montesquieu. And this is another very interesting read and a very influential political treatise, which will impact the founding fathers and the framers of America and the Constitution. And then this section, the Third Intercolonial War, King George's Wars, will conclude with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. I don't know if that's how you say that word correctly. This ended the Austrian succession in Europe, and it ended King George's Wars against Spain and France in the American colonies. And this section is finally over, and now we go to the fourth and final section of this chapter, which is called the Fourth Intercolonial War from 1749 to 1763. And this begins with the Second Acadian War. Most historians call this Father Lelouch's War. We don't call it that. We call it the Second Acadian War because it's taking place mostly in Acadia. And this war begins right after, like, the same year as the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Or no, uh, within a year of that treaty. That treaty was in 1748. Now we're in 1749. And so, pretty quickly, the stipulations of peace are violated, and they're violated by the British, specifically by Governor Edward Cornwallis. I wonder if that name rings any bells. This is not the Cornwallis that surrenders, that's Charles Cornwallis. This is Edward Cornwallis. This is his uncle. So the Cornwallis who surrenders at Yorktown in a couple decades from this point of time is the nephew of this guy, Edward Cornwallis, who begins the Second Acadian War, and by violating the stipulations of peace. And so we have a couple battles. We have a couple battles from this war, from the Second Acadian War. Again, people call it Father Loche's War. Cornwallis will issue a scalp bounty proclamation, so scalping will become very popular because of Edward Cornwallis. You have the Treaty of Madrid between Spain and Portugal. This is to replace the old Treaty of Tordesillas and redefine the clear territorial boundaries in their American and Asian possessions based on effective control instead of just drawing a line on the map. So at this point, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was issued between Spain and Portugal all the way back in 1494, is now revoked and replaced by the Treaty of Madrid. Then you have a second Treaty of Madrid between Spain and England. This is between Great Britain and Spain over the issue of the Asiento. What? I thought it was solved. No. Ironically, during the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, during the negotiations for that treaty, the Spanish and the English totally forgot to solve the issue of the Asiento. And only after the treaty was signed did they realize that they didn't address the issue of the Asiento at all. And so now with this treaty, the Treaty of Madrid, they finally addressed the issue by renewing trading rights to Great Britain to trade with Spain, and for a one-time gift of giving Britain 100,000 pounds. It's an insane amount of money back then. This improved relations between Spain and Britain. So by the time of the French and Indian War, which will happen in a couple years, Spain will remain neutral. Again, this is why knowing all these treaties and keeping track of the treaties and all these alliances are so important to understanding why these wars happen and why the outcomes were what they were. Spain will be neutral in the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War because Great Britain and Spain will have this more peaceful relationship. One, you have a pacifist on the Spanish throne, and two, they have this treaty which settles a lot of the disputes between England and Spain. Here's yet another document from the Great Awakening, the Calvinist Awakening. Although this is mostly a religious document, it is also very much a political document, and this is written by Jonathan Mayhew, a discourse concerning unlimited submission and non-resistance to the higher powers. And so this is saying that citizens were not morally bound to obey rulers who enacted unjust laws. The work challenged traditional notions of absolute authority and became an influential text advocating resistance to tyranny in the American colonies. Remember, our founding fathers are kids at this point. They're being born in the 1730s and 40s and 50s, and they're kids, they're growing up, and they are being influenced by the First Great Awakening, the Calvinist Revival, and by these sermons, which, although are mostly a religious kind of teaching, it's also very much a political teaching, especially this sermon right here. Then you have the raid on Dartmouth. This is yet another raid during the Second Acadian War. You have the Currency Act of 1751, which prohibited the issuance of paper money by the colony of Massachusetts and other New England colonies, aiming to stabilize colonial currency and protect British merchants from depreciation or inflation. The act fueled colonial resentment by restricting economic flexibility and was seen as an early example of imperial interference in local governance. Again, this is yet another example of the idea that of salutary neglect not really being a real thing. A lot of people, even people back then, salutary neglect is a contemporary term used by members of parliament just shortly after this time period, and I don't really think that it's a real thing. I mean, it's not as real as people make it out to be, because as we see, every single one of these sections, every single one of these monarchs will pass regulations and enforcement over the colonies when it comes to trade, when it comes to piracy, when it comes to now currency, when it comes to all sorts of things. Parliament was regulating and passing more regulations. So I don't really believe in the concept of salutary neglect. At least there needs to be a bunch of addendums when you talk about, and a bunch of footnotes when you talk about salutary neglect, because it's not what people say it is. It wasn't, the king and parliament doing absolutely nothing. It wasn't complete neglect of the colonies. There very much were regulations going all the way back to the founding of the colonies, back to James the First in the 1600s, the early 1600s. So I don't necessarily agree with the idea of salutary neglect. So I mean, that's just me based on the evidence that we've compiled so far. Here's yet another raid of the during the Second Acadian War. And again, yet another example of the king and parliament getting involved in colonial affairs, which means that salutary neglect is not actually real, or at least as real as people say it is. And so this proclamation concerning the appointment and authority of officers in the colony of Georgia, the order addressed administrative organization within the trustee government and clarified the roles and responsibilities of colonial officials serving under the charter system. The proclamation reflected ongoing adjustments in imperial governance as Britain sought to stabilize and regularize authority in its American colonies during the mid-18th century, particularly in regions still governed under proprietary or trustee arrangements. So, again, more of the king and parliament trying to regulate the colonies. So now we have Governor Dinwiddie orders Major George Washington to warn the French to leave. And so there's a movie that's about to come out tomorrow called Young Washington, and it will depict this event. How Governor Dinwiddie and ordering Major George Washington to go find the French on the frontier in the Ohio River Valley past the Appalachian Mountains in order to tell the French to leave. And so the British are very much planning to expand the colonies past the Appalachians. All the way up until 1750, the Appalachians was a barrier preventing the English from going further inland to Mississippi and also to the Ohio River Valley. And so that's the barrier, and most of the frontier, what the English called the frontier, was actually the Piedmont Plateau. So the place of settlement was the coast, the frontier was the Piedmont Plateau, and then you have the border or barrier a natural barrier, which was the Appalachians. By 1750, that barrier is now no longer a barrier as the English start to traverse the Appalachians. I think in the year 1750, I think I have to add that to the timeline. The year 1750 was when the first English expedition to traverse the Appalachians. Um, I'll have to do more research on that and add that to the timeline. So only a couple years later, the English are now telling the French to leave the Ohio River Valley and in preparation for the English to settle there. And George Washington, his very first mission is to do this, to go to the frontier and tell the French to leave. And the French will say, no, we're not going to leave. And Washington will return to Williamsburg, and he will become famous for this. But he becomes even more famous for his second mission, which is going back to the French, telling them to leave again, and the French diplomat is killed by a Native American. In this engraving, it shows it shows a colonist killing the French diplomat. It was actually a Native American who killed the French diplomat, and it's called the Jumonville Affair, and this happened on May 28th, 1754. A lot of people think that this is the start of the French and Indian War, that George Washington started the French and Indian War. You have to keep in mind, the Second Acadian War is still going on. It started years prior. It started all the way back in 1749. We're now in 1754. And so the French and English, they're already fighting each other. They're already out, at each other's throats. So Washington didn't start any new violence. He didn't start a war between France and England because they were already fighting each other. What he did was he brought the war to the frontier. The Second Acadian War is happening primarily in Acadia. That's why we call it the Second Acadian War, which is modern-day Nova Scotia, just north of Maine. And Washington's mission and the Jumonville Affair will bring the fighting to the frontier in the Ohio River Valley past the Appalachians. And it's not really the start of the French and Indian War, because the Jumonville Affair happens in 1754. Excuse me. The French and Indian War does not begin, at least officially, until 2 years later, and I'll get to that declaration of war pretty soon. So yeah, the Jumonville Affair, and then soon after the Jumonville Affair, Washington will establish Fort Necessity, which is a really pathetic wooden fort that falls to the French and Native American forces really quickly. And it's during this time, again, during the Second Acadian War, just prior to the official beginning of the French and Indian War, you have Benjamin Franklin, who's a Pennsylvanian, even though he was originally from Boston, he's a Pennsylvanian, and he creates this plan called the Albany Plan. And it's very similar to the Plan of Colonial Union by William Penn all the way in the 1690s. So right around the time that Benjamin Franklin was born, actually. A decade or two before. And, William Penn is a huge influence on Pennsylvanians, and it makes sense that a Pennsylvanian will want to bring that idea back into the foreground. And so Benjamin Franklin, being a printer guy, publisher, he makes this image of a snake that's been chopped up. And each piece of the snake is a different colony. And so, the snake, when it's chopped up like this, is dead. But if the snake was joined, all these different parts were joined together, then the snake would be strong and be able to fight. So that's what Benjamin Franklin is advocating for. Nothing really happens with the Albany plan at this point, but the idea of colonial union will come back again for the First Continental Congress in the next chapter that we cover. And because of what happened a year before at Fort Necessity, Braddock will send a expedition, or he'll be part of the expedition, all the way to kick the French out. And so he's going to be going from Alexandria in Virginia. He's going to traverse the Appalachians, go right to Fort Necessity, and then make his way all the way to the Ohio River Valley. And he will be met and ambushed and killed. His expedition will fail here. And while that's going on, the British fighting the French and the Native Americans in the deep interior frontier, you have a successful British battle. I cannot say these French names. Fort Biosor. This guy, Robert Monckton, he is I think he's a general, and he will win this is the last major engagement, last major battle of the Second Acadian War. Again, some people call it the Father Loche's War, and this is the last of the fighting in Acadia, as the fighting will now transition into the Ohio River Valley and the frontier. Here's a sea battle. Again, I just love these paintings of all these sea battles. You have Braddock's defeat on July 9th, 1755. You have the Battle of Petit Kodiak. This is between British colonial forces from Massachusetts and Acadian militiamen led by French officer Charles Descamps de Boishbert et de Refentot. These French names, never. And it took place in the Acadian village de Blanchard. And it is following this battle where you have the deportation of the Acadians, not just this battle, but also this successful battle over here. So the deportation of the Acadians are the French colonists in Acadia, modern-day Nova Scotia, and many of them will go as far south as New Orleans. And these are the people who will become known as Cajuns, and they're named after Acadia. Cajun, Acadia, I guess it's similar enough. So the Cajuns come actually from Canada. And they're originally French. So they're French Canadians moving down to New Orleans. During this time, you have more Native violence because, of course, I don't think there's that many times where Native Americans and British colonists were at peace with each other. And so Pennsylvania will reply to their own governor about Native raids. And the governor's not really doing too much to respond to Native raids on the frontier, while the Pennsylvania Assembly is much more concerned with the Native raids. A very similar thing happened with Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, where you had some Native fighting, especially against the frontiersmen, and Bacon's Rebellion was happening at the same time as King Philip's War. This is the 1670s, 1675, 1676, or 1676, and the royal governor of Virginia back then was not really doing all that much to help defend the frontiersmen, the English colonists on the frontier when dealing with native raids. And this angered the Virginians back then, and now it's angering the Pennsylvanians because their governor is doing the same thing, which is not much at all to deal with the native raids. You have the Convention of Westminster between Britain and Prussia. This is when they agree to have a defensive alliance. And so, again, understanding the treaties is very important and keeping track, because now the British and the Prussians are friends and they're allies with each other. And this will drag the British into the 7 Years' War, because here I'm just going to show it on the timeline. You have the Battle of Fort Bull, French victory near modern-day Rome, New York. This is, again, during the Second Acadian War, not yet the official French and Indian War, which begins pretty soon after. You have the Treaty of Versailles, 1756. This agreement aligned the Kingdom of France with the Archduchy of Austria. Remember, in the last section, the French fought the Austrians. The Austrians were allied with the British, and that's why the British and the French fought each other. Also because the English were already fighting the Spanish, who were allied with the French. But now the alliances have shifted. Spain, even though Spain is an ally of France, because Spain and England had solved their differences with the Treaty of Madrid, resolving the Asiento problem, the Spanish will remain neutral and not join the French in fighting the Prussians, which will bring the British in, because of the Convention of Westminster, the English and the Prussians are now allied with each other, even though the Prussians were fighting their former ally, the Austrians, and France is now allied with Austria. So, again, keeping track of all these treaties and who's fighting who and why is very, very complicated, even when you organize it on the timeline. Here's one of the very first, or very last, engagements of the Acadian War in modern-day Nova Scotia. And now, finally, officially, Great Britain declares war on France in 1756. So, the French and Indian War, which this is a part of, does not begin in 1754 with the Jumonville Affair and George Washington. It officially begins with Great Britain declaring war in 1756 against France. Even the Acadian War, the Second Acadian War, even though the French and the British are fighting each other, they're not officially at war. It's just a frontier thing rather than an all-out European conflict. So the war officially begins here, 1756. And one of the first battles of the French and Indian War is the Battle of Fort Oswego, which is off the shore of Lake Ontario, whatever. And then Frederick the Great, he begins the 7 Years' War, which is a Central European conflict, not to be confused with the French and Indian War. Frederick the Great begins the 7 Years' War by invading Saxony. And this is a Central European conflict. And this happens after the British declare war on France. So a lot of people say that the French and Indian War is just the North American theater of the 7 Years' War. That's not true. The French and Indian War began first, and then the 7 Years' War happened, which was mostly a war between Frederick the Great of Prussia and the Austrians by attacking their ally, Saxony. Again, knowing who's allied with who is very important, but also very confusing during this time. You have a infamous, infamous event, and they might depict this in the movie. I'm gonna go see the movie tomorrow. Comes out July 3rd, and it's called Young Washington. And this is the siege of Fort William Henry, and the British are being sieged by the French and their native allies, and the British give up. They surrender the fort, but as soon as the English leave, the Native Americans start to kill the English. So the Native Americans allied with the French kill the British who had just surrendered to the French. And this happens. We don't have any primary sources from the Native Americans themselves explaining exactly why they committed this massacre, killing 200 people, and a lot of them were civilians who were just at the fort. And it was probably because of years of native wars, of colonists massacring natives, natives massacring colonists, leads to even more massacres, which this will lead to even more massacres, which will lead to even more. So it's this cyclical, like, repeating thing where one massacre justifies the next massacre, which justifies the next massacre. And, you have to put in a lot of effort to stop the killing. And both sides are responsible for not killing civilians. All sides of all conflicts are responsible for not killing civilians. As soon as you justify killing civilians today by the actions that were done in the past, then you're no better than the people who committed those atrocities in the past. You are not actually justified in killing civilians. Military combatants, that's a different story, but civilians, no. So, this is official opinion of our charity. Do not kill civilians. I don't think that should be that controversial. Here's the Battle of Bloody Creek, an Acadian and Micmac militia defeated a detachment of British soldiers of the 43rd Regiment at Bloody Creek. This is a pretty bloody battle of the French and Indian War, although not as bad as the massacre at Fort William Henry. Here's the Laws of Nations by Emmerich de Vattel. And this is an important, maybe not important, but it is an interesting political read of understanding civics at this time, or like what people believed in when it comes to their civic philosophy. You have the Battle of Cartagena. Again, I'm so bad at pronouncing these names. But this is a British naval victory, and again, I love these paintings. These are phenomenal paintings. And a lot of them, they're not like random paintings of random ships. They're actual battles that they're depicting. And so putting all of these paintings on the timeline, like, with their associated battle, it makes this history a little bit more visually engaging than just reading the text of the battle itself. So I'm very thankful for all these painters. A lot of them are from the 18 and 1900s. At our charity, we hope one day, if we can raise enough money, to start a art studio and hire classically trained artists, painters mostly, to paint scenes like this for all of the events and battles that we don't have a painting for, because there's so much history that isn't depicted on a painting that I think should be, a fascinating, interesting painting like this, at least. So Here's another beautiful painting. This is from 1758, so this is a contemporary painting of the siege of Louisbourg. The British force attacked Louisbourg against, again, another typo. Hey, at least this is how you know this is not ChatGPT, because there are so many typos. Because I have to type these myself. So I'll have to make a note of that and fix that. So this is a British force attacking a French force and their native allies, the Micmac. The French attempted to send reinforcements by sea, but were not able to, as the fleet was blocked and defeated by the British. The battle ended French colonial dominance in the Atlantic Canada near modern-day Nova Scotia, and led to the subsequent British campaign to capture Quebec in 1759 and the remainder of the New France the following year. You have a French victory at the Battle of Fort Colonial, which was renamed Ticonderoga. That name should sound familiar for anyone who has studied American Revolutionary history. You have the Battle of Fort Frontenac. Here's an engraving. Again, I want to have like classically trained painters to paint all these scenes. And for any paintings that can be touched up as well. Fort de Cusney. If you remember the engraving of Braddock's expedition, so here's Fort Necessity. This is where this is near where the Drummondville affair happened, and Fort Necessity incident with George Washington. And then Braddock's defeat happens all the way over here, right next to Fort de Cusney. And so it wasn't near the fort. It was close enough to the fort, but it wasn't at the fort. And so now we're at the Battle of de Cusney. Let me see if I can find it again. Right here. Which happens 4 years after, I guess 5 years, 3 years after the Braddock's defeat. And so the British are back. And the British, they passed a Two-Penny Act, which is yet again another piece of evidence for or against the idea of salutary neglect. Again, there are so many laws and regulations and enforcement by the King and Parliament over colonial issues. And so this is one that pops up with the Parsons Cause case, where the Virginia Assembly passed the Two-Penny Act, allowing debts payable to Anglican clergy in tobacco to be paid at a fixed rate of 2 pence per pound, rather than the market value of tobacco, which had sharply increased. And so you have to understand the Anglican pastors, the clergy, at this time, because of a scarcity of money, were paid in tobacco. And then the tobacco would then be sold on the market by the clergy, and that will be their salary. That will be their money to be clergy. Well, because the value of tobacco is much valuable and the price is going up because they're at war, they're fighting the French and Indian War, and native raids are disturbing the farms, and a lot of their men are having to be sent to the war effort. The supply of tobacco is going down as production goes down, which, if you know anything about supply and demand, if demand doesn't change, or if demand increases and supply decreases, then price will increase. And so the value of tobacco is increasing. And so in order to stabilize the salaries of the Anglican clergy, that's the Church of England, the Virginia Assembly passes this Two-Penny Act. This act sparked controversy between colonial authorities and the Church of England, which is run by the king, highlighting tensions over colonial self-governance and imperial control. So again, yet another example of the king and parliament not letting colonial affairs be solely colonial affairs. They are getting involved in even something as minor as the salaries of the clergy of the Church of England in Virginia. Like, that's how minute these regulations and oversight by the king and parliament is on the colonies, which disproves the theory of salutary neglect. Now you have the Treaty of Easton, a treaty between British colonials, namely from Pennsylvania, and the tribes of the Iroquois, Lenape, and Shawnee. This weakened the French war effort, who relied on their native support. And this is, I think this is a replica, or it might be the actual, I think it's a replica, an Iroquois pipe, tomahawk, from the Easton peace talks. Actually, it might be the real thing. I'll have to double check, which would be really cool. It's a pipe in the shape of a tomahawk, and it represents peace from war, and it's an Iroquois tradition. And the fact that we still have this specific peace tomahawk pipe is from 1758 is very impressive. If it's the real thing and not a replica. Here's General Forbes' expedition arrives at Fort Duquesne, and this is an engraving of George Washington, and this might be depicted in the film tomorrow. We'll see. This is a depiction of George Washington planting the Union flag on the ruins of Fort Duquesne, and this is during the French and Indian War in 1758. So Washington, who's already famous at this point, is going to become even more famous from this war. And this Fort Duquesne will be renamed Fort Pitt, as in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in western Pennsylvania. And so that's interesting. Then you have the Siege of Fort Niagara. British General Sir William Johnson and General John Prideaux. Here's the Battle of La Belle Famille. Francois Marie La Marchande de Lingeray, again, I'm butchering these French names, led a relief force to Fort Niagara, but was ambushed just miles from the fort by British and Iroquois militia who defeated them. And then Ferdinand VI dies. Charles III becomes King of Spain. Charles VI of Spain was a bit of a pacifist. He negotiated a peace of King George's War between England and Spain, and now he's dead. And he kept Spain neutral during the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. And now he's replaced by Charles III. And Charles III will be more active in European affairs. You have the Battle of Lagos, and again, amazing paintings of this time period, which is just off of Cadiz in southern Spain. Now, again, this is one of my favorite paintings. I have it as the background for this chapter at the top too, as you can see. And this painting by Benjamin West, a very famous painter. He painted many famous American Revolutionary War paintings are by Benjamin West. And this depicts the death of General Wolfe at the Battle of Plains of Abraham in order to take Quebec. And so you have this battle going on in the background, and General Wolfe and his entourage comforting him as he dies at the battle. British win that battle, and they are able to take Quebec with the Articles of Capitulation. You have the Battle of Quiberon Bay. I'm not sure if that's how you say it. A decisive naval engagement between the Royal Navy and the French Navy in the Bay off the coast of France. And this is the culmination of British efforts to eliminate French naval superiority, which would have given the French the ability to carry out their planned invasion of Great Britain. And so this is a British victory. And let's see. I think this battle, or it might be another battle, pretty during this time period, where the song "Rule Britannia" is made. I'm not sure about this battle. I'm not sure if I made a note on it on the timeline or not. And so at this point, because of this battle and this war, the British are now the dominant naval power of the world. Before it was the Spanish and the Portuguese, and then the Spanish Armada is sunk, and that included a large contingent of the Portuguese fleet as well. And now the French naval force is defeated, and the British are now just the rulers of the Atlantic for the most part, and soon the rulers of the Indian and Pacific Oceans as well. Here's a French victory at the Battle of Sainte-Foy. Siege of Quebec. The French try to retake Quebec. Battle of Point aux Trembles. British fought to lift the French siege of Quebec. Not gonna say this. Restige Gauche. Battle of Restige Gauche River. Is a battle between British Royal Navy and a small flotilla of vessels of the French Navy in Acadia. Battle of 1,000 Islands. Small French garrison at Fort Levis held a much larger British army at bay for over a week, managing to sink 2 British warships and to cripple a third. The resistance delayed the British advance to Montreal from the west. The British eventually won at Montreal, and so Montreal surrendered to the British. King George II dies, and King George III, the infamous King George III, becomes King of England on October 25th, 1760. And on his first day as king, he declares that he wants an end to the war. That's the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War, since he saw it benefiting Hanover's interests in Europe, while Britain was being ruined financially by the expense of the war. So Hanover is somewhat owned by the British, or I think mostly owned by the British, since it's the Hanoverian dynasty. And while the monarch's interest in Hanover is being protected by their participation in the 7 Years' War, it's at the cost of Great Britain itself. At the capture of Belle Isle and a British victory. And so towards the end of the war, the British will have a bunch of victories, which will give them the upper hand in peace talks with the French. Another British victory. Excuse me. Another British victory. The French do seize St. John's, but only briefly, and at the Battle of Signal Hill, the British take St. John's back, and that is the last major battle of the French and Indian War, which is negotiated peacefully at the Treaty of Paris, by the Treaty of Paris in 1763. So February 10th, 1763. This ends the 7 Years' War in Central Europe, French and Indian War in North America, between Great Britain, France, Spain, and Austria, Prussia, and so many other belligerents as well. And like with all the documents, if you want to read a document, you just click on the Read Document button on the timeline, and it will take you to the full text of the document if you're interested in reading it. And so this is the very last document that we have on this section, the fourth Intercolonial War section. And it's also the last document for this chapter, chapter 3 of the colonial era, which is called the Intercolonial Wars. And it's also the last document of the entire era. So we are now done with the colonial era. It is over. It took 3 chapters, 3 days to talk about it. 2 days ago, we started these series of live streams, and we talked about chapter 1, and then yesterday we talked about chapter 2. Today was chapter 3. Tomorrow, July 3rd, will be chapter 4. We're going to cover the 12 years leading up to the American Revolution, and then on July 4th, I will be having a live stream talking about chapter 5, which will cover the War for Independence. And so I'm excited to get through all of these chapters. I'm going to be doing a live stream every single day, and each day we're going to cover a different chapter. And so there's 26 chapters total, 26 days in a row, and that I'm going to be doing this. And so if you guys in the audience have any questions about this history that we're covering, just let me know in the comments while the live stream's going on, and I'll be more than happy to engage with you guys, ask questions and stuff like that. And yeah, so tomorrow we're going to start chapter 4, which is the start of the Revolutionary Era, and covering the lead up to the American Revolution, because there's so many aspects to it that people leave out, historians and academics and educators. Oh, excuse me. I've been doing this for 2.5 hours now, about the same time as chapter 1. Chapter 2 was a little bit faster. And so yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this long live stream and all this history. I hope you learned something new about our old past. And if you're interested in learning more about what this channel is about and what this charity is about, you can go to our website, www.tarpeia.us. There will be a link in the description, and this is chapter 3 of the compendium. The compendium is our library, our online and free to use, free to access library of primary source documents and historical events that are organized in this interactive timeline format. And so you can go through, read all these documents, read about all these events in a pretty well organized manner. Everything's chronological, and we don't separate history by themes or anything like that. We just show the history. If there's overlapping themes, you should know about how they overlap and how one theme of history influences another theme of history. And so I hope you guys enjoyed. We are an educational nonprofit, a 501c3. And so if you want to donate, you can donate to us on our website, or if you have a larger donation that you want to give through something like a donor advised fund, just reach out to me on my email, Mark, that's Mark with a K, at Tarpeia, TARPEIA.us, and I'll give you more information that you'll need, like our EIN and our address. So yeah, again, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys learned something new. If you like what we do, please support the charity and the channel. Share, subscribe, do everything that you know what to do to support a charity and a YouTube channel. And I hope to see you guys tomorrow. So thank you and have a nice day.